Hello, everyone. This is Jana Stafford with BIC Magazine. Welcome to our webinar, Fear of Change, How to Prepare for the Latest Regulatory Updates. I will introduce our moderator in a few minutes, but first, a few quick pointers regarding your desktop webinar console. Our presenters' webcams will appear in the media player window, which is in the upper right corner. It could look a little different on your mobile. You can resize the media player and the slide window. At the bottom of your screen, there is a purple Q&A widget to type in questions anytime during the presentation. The Q&A will occur toward the end. The green Related Content widget has a few helpful items related to our discussion today, including an extended bio for each panelist. The light blue widget is where you'll find panelist info. If you experience any technical problems, please click the yellow widget with the question mark. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Montrose Environmental. Montrose knows that dealing with the logistics and implications of environmental issues is vital. With more than 1,700 employees in 70 locations, Montrose focuses on environmental solutions with an integrated approach to design, engineering, and operations. They apply the latest technologies to solve difficult environmental challenges today and prepare for what's coming tomorrow. From lab services to stack testing to regulatory compliance, Montrose helps clients blaze new trails. Please visit them at montrose-env.com. Our moderator for today's webinar is Tanya Jackson. She is Vice President of LDAR USA with Montrose Environmental. Tanya brings over 10 years of industry experience to the Montrose team. Prior to this, Tanya worked for companies such as Montrose Air Quality Services, Avanti Environmental, and South Coast Air Quality in a variety of roles. Tanya is a leader in the LDAR industry and is Method 21 certified, as well as certified OGI thermographer. And now I'd like to hand the mic over to Tanya, who will introduce the rest of the panelists.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you haven't joined us in the past, this is our last series, our last webinar in the series of our Fear of Change. And today we're going to be focusing on the fear of change, how to prepare for the latest regulatory updates. And exciting for all of us is that a lot of regulatory updates just dropped yesterday. So we're going to have some really exciting and important information to share with you. And opposed to our other presentations that we've had, we are using a panelist this time of experts. So let me go ahead and introduce our team today. Terrence Trefiak, Vice President for Leak Detection and Repair for Canada for Montrose Environmental Group. We have Scott Cherbach, Senior Vice President of Enterprise Risk and Regulatory Affairs for Montrose Environmental Group. Deaver Bradley, Senior Principal for SLR Consulting. And Christy Woodward, she's a Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. So thank you everyone for joining us. The regulatory landscape that we're starting to see has a major shift for LDAR, and with that, our industry is going to be required to make a lot of changes. Again, so did you hear that? Did you get a little bit nervous when I said regulatory change? Because I think a lot of people do. It gives people a bit of discomfort and fear. So, and that's completely understandable. Those of you who have had any previous installments in our Fear of Change knows where I'm going with this, and it's really important. That's because me even mentioning regulatory change by name causes the slightest spike in stress is probably what you're feeling, which is most likely shock and disorientation. And something it's all of us feel whenever we're presented with a prospect of change. In fact, it's first in what psychologists refer to a four-step process of how we as humans internalize change, perceived to be a negative or harmful. What's interesting about what you might feel about new regulatory updates is it's kind of prolonged. It's more intensive experience of what you feel when you stub your toe or you accidentally smash your finger with a hammer. So peel away all that physical pain from those moments and think about what you feel more mentally and emotionally, however brief that may be. The shock and disorientation you're feeling now about regulatory change isn't too far removed from that. That's because whether it's getting a paper cut or on an envelope or even trying to wrap your head around new regulations, both events are steeped in the unknown. You might even say that it's unexpected or uncertain, and that's cut from the same cloth. There's two halves of the same coin. You didn't know there was a Lego brick on the stairs when you decided to walk down them this morning barefoot, but that's a nice unexpected surprise if you have kids. And in the same way, we don't always like the unexpected, we always hate uncertainty. Studies have shown that our brains are even more hardwired to resist uncertainty in all of its forms, however small it may be. So we go right into that same fight or flight response mode that we do when we drop our coffee in our car before we even had that first sip. Sure, we knew these updates were probably coming, but how many of you know what these updates actually mean for you now that they've been released? That uncertainty is at the core of your fear, and fear can be paralyzing. And when you're paralyzed, you're at greatest risk of not being in compliance by required timeframes. Well, luckily, that's where we're going to come in today. The unknown becomes the known. You're going to gain clarity of what is happening and how you should respond. And once we give you knowledge and clarity on what the regulatory updates are, what it means for your organizations, and the steps you need to take to respond and become compliant, you can fast track to that final and most pleasant and beneficial stage of our uncertainty process, acceptance and moving forward. So while others are going to be preoccupied in that shock and maybe even angry, like you would be yelling at your kids for leaving Legos on the stairs and struggling to come to terms with the change, you'll have already made changes necessary to prepare yourself for the regulatory updates, and your facility is going to be ready for compliance. So to sum it up, we're going to give you a life hack. So let's go ahead and get started with our panelists. We're going to direct our first question to Scott Turbach. Scott, maybe you can tell us what changes do you foresee directed to climate change?
Hey, Tanya, nice to be here. Thank you. So there's a number of drivers here, market drivers and industry drivers that the landscape has changed considerably. A few weeks ago, EPA published their strategic plan of strategic objectives from 2022 through 2026. And their number one objective was climate. And the number one way they're going to get there is to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. How are they going to do that? Well, that's consistent with the regulation changes that we saw, consistent with what we saw yesterday from EPA's announcement of the methane rule. The DOT finalized their rule yesterday for gathering pipelines, the Pipes Act. So there's going to be a lot of regulatory changes that influence all aspects upstream, midstream, and downstream oil and gas. You know, it's going to impact them all in a little bit of a different way. But even outside of the regulations, you're going to see increase of another one of EPA's objectives, and that's enforcement. Using the enforcement hammer that can force alternative compliance, driving other climate change issues and initiatives, as well as SEPs and secondary environmental programs. So beyond the EPA's realm, we also have to consider forces that we haven't seen in the environmental landscape, and that's ESG and investor demands and influences and pressures. There's a growing demand for the disclosure of accurate and reliable greenhouse gas reporting data. So it goes beyond just what are the rules and complying with the rules, but you also now have this other ESG pressure from investors. And finally, beyond all of that, a company has to start looking at their own risk profile and what makes sense. Some states like Colorado in the upstream has Reg 7 where they're requiring fence line monitoring. If you're an upstream provider, maybe you start considering providing those same types of activities at your other facilities that aren't located in Colorado, because from a risk perspective and from a best practices, you know, where do you do one thing, where not the other? So it's a very interesting time. And I believe, the oil and gas industry, upstream, midstream, downstream, is going to have some turbulent waters to navigate. There's going to be some really good opportunity for optimization, and for companies to truly embrace that optimization, I think, gain a significant strategic advantage.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that update. Let's go to Christy. Christy, what were the main challenges the industry overcame in Colorado? You know, Colorado is one of those states that's really been ahead of the curve. So how have you guys overcame to meet the methane regulations?
Sure. You know, obviously there's a lot of big data that goes into particularly the LDAR piece of the methane regulations, the fence line monitoring as well. I think, you know, I've been at KOGA now for 3.5 years, and we've done 17 rulemakings in that time. And so to be able to track and process and comply with all of those, both from an industry perspective and from a state perspective, has been a real challenge. There's lots of new databases being put into place, inventories that are trying to be verified through some monitoring, be that aerial flyovers or fence line information. So it's just a lot of big data. It's a lot of trust. It's a lot of relationship building that allows us to be able to create creative rules that allow for innovation that's necessary in this space. And it's a lot of requests for industry to be very transparent in how that data is provided. So it's a high-level answer to a pretty complicated question, but those would be the big drivers for me that were difficult.
And what is it that Colorado is working on now? They've had a lot of recent regulatory updates, but it sounds like they have some more work that they're doing behind the scenes. What's going on over there?
Sure. We have a upcoming rulemaking in the December timeframe in front of the Air Quality Control Commission. It is focused around greenhouse gases, and there are 7 or 8 main topical points in that rulemaking. There's a call for a greenhouse gas intensity program. There's a requirement to control and mitigate well unloading. They're looking at testing enclosed combustion devices statewide. They're doing direct regulation of the midstream sector as it pertains to pigging and blowdown emissions. They're going to create a steering committee that will look at electrification, particular to midstream facilities, to attempt to lower some of the CO2 emissions associated with combustion. There's also enhanced LDAR and monitoring as a requirement. In Colorado, in July of this year, we passed a Senate Bill 21-1266 that looks at environmental justice, in particular for disproportionately impacted communities. And so there will be some enhanced leak detection and repair that will be required in those communities. They're currently being mapped, and we're trying to assess where they're located. We're also looking to assess how we can further reduce our emissions in those communities. And then there's also some alternate proposals that are being put forth just as recently as last Thursday to look at enhanced leak detection and monitoring as often as monthly at all well facilities and compressor stations statewide. That can be supplemented through aerial monitoring as well to provide some off-ramps for on-the-ground surveying. And then, of course, in the leak detection and repair space, we're also working to implement a rulemaking from 2019 that has that sort of fence line monitoring. You know, people really likes to use that term because it's really a receptor-based monitoring. But that's an agnostic regulation, and people are really looking at new technologies, testing new technologies. There's lots of research going on here at both the School of Mines and CSU in that space as well. So lots of moving parts and pieces. I know that's, again, a 30,000-foot answer to what is a very complex rule, probably the biggest we've seen since 2014.
That enhanced LDAR is really interesting, so it'll be great to see how that starts to formulate and come together. So definitely we'll have to stay in touch on that. Thank you. Terrence, can you speak to us on what's going on in Canada? They've had some regulations come out over the previous years, and one is recently going to be coming up in 2022. Can you give us an update on that?
Yeah, so up north here in 2020, we had a new federal regulation that became effective that required, basically regulated methane emissions across oil and gas facilities across Canada. And it required leak detection on facilities that really had no requirement previous to that. One of the one of the main things of that, or main components of that regulation was that it allowed each province to come up with their own regulations that may meet or exceed the federal regulation, which was unique, and also allowed for the use of alternative technologies that you had to get approval, but you could use alternative technologies in replace or to adjust the normal monitoring frequencies. So, and funny enough, it was, I think the federal regulation in Canada was modeled a bit, bit closely to the Quad A regulation, modified somewhat, but basically required that compressor stations and gas plants be monitored 3 times a year in general, and well sites 1 time a year. And then depending on the province you're in, that may be changed, the frequency may be changed or adjusted depending on the province.
Wow. So what were some of the challenges that in meeting those regulations, because that was completely new for industry up there?
Yeah, I think, some of the benefits of the program and that it was flexible and adjusting to different provinces and different technologies also created some challenges. So if you're in one province, the frequency might be set at, annual different for certain facilities, and another province, it may be triannual or different frequency. And, and beyond that, there's different changes that you may have to do to meet that regulation, different province. So if you're following a gas pipeline and you're, going through from one side of the country to the next, those regulations may change to different facilities as you go through different provinces. So it did create some challenges into making sure that you're following the right procedures and protocols for that particular province. Also, in terms of scheduling, because it was a new regulation, a lot of companies had never done any surveying on their facilities before. Some of our clients did do pre-surveys, so they went out and did a full baseline survey before the regulation became effective. So they kind of got a handle on, what the cost would be, what the timing would be, and they were prepared for when the regulation actually became effective. But other clients just waited till the last minute, the last month of that first monitoring frequency to do their surveys, and that really created some chaos in certain clients where they, didn't plan enough time or didn't plan accordingly for repair cycles, and they had to learn throughout the year how to do that. So really, the pre-planning before the regulation becomes effective was important, and then that relates to resources, right? If all of the clients waited till the last minute, us and other competitors that were doing the surveying, contractors doing the surveying, were really bunched up and trying to get things done in a short period of time. So being able to space things out helped not only with the contractors doing the work, but also for repair cycles. So if you have all your surveys done at one time, you're going to have all these leaks and all these repairs done at the same time. If you space those out, you're going to have a more relaxed system that can give you more time and more resources to effect or to make those repairs. And then just the data management was also a challenge. I think especially on facilities that haven't had any requirement before. Now they're required to record leaks, record repairs, record the repair actions, and then report. All that data coming in from different sources has to be managed or should be managed in one receptacle, and that caused a lot of problems for a lot of our clients that didn't have a data management system in place, or didn't plan for that.
Great, thank you for that update. And I just wanted to remind everyone, there's a question and answer portion after this, after the panelists are done talking. So feel free to submit questions that you have throughout the whole webinar, and then we'll get to those questions at the end. So Deaver, maybe you can give us an update on what's going on from the consulting side and what you're hearing from your clients. Are clients taking a more preemptive action to go beyond compliance and reduce their emissions?
Sure, Tanya. Thanks for having me. You caught me right in the middle of an LDAR audit here at a refinery. So I would say people are taking some preemptive actions, mainly for methane, and mainly for the non-regulatory ESG reasons that Scott mentioned. I think there are a few facilities considering pilot runs of OGI, but most of the ones I've talked to have been taking a wait-and-see approach on EPA's revised AWP, alternate work practice, and Appendix K protocol, as well as the oil and gas proposed rules before they do anything more definitive.
Great. And then same question, or over to you, Deaver, still. Other than Method 21 and OGI, are there any alternative technologies being considered in these new regulations that we're starting to see come out?
In the Appendix K, that protocol that I've read yesterday, which is the day it came out, they're not any more specific other than a camera and having certain specifications. I think, going to conferences, we all see that people have different technologies that they're out there, different offshoots of cameras, drones and stuff like that. But we're still sort of wait and see on those technologies based on really what the rule is going to allow.
And this can go out to Deaver as well as Terrence and Christy, who have more experience with the OGI. But what are the reasons behind the slow adoption of OGI? It's been out since 2008 to be approved, and we have the alternative work practice. But it's still quite a few facilities that have been slow in the uptake, other than Colorado, even from a state perspective, being approved in a regulation to use. You guys have opinions on why it's been such a slow adoption?
I'll go first on that one and let these guys chime in. I mean that the annual Method 21 monitoring requirement in the alternative work practices has been the big hang-up for the longest time, and as long as that's been part of the AWP, the cost effectiveness of bi-monthly OGI was still higher or maybe cost neutral. And I think there's also been some secondary hesitation on industry's part, regarding how EPA and state agencies might evaluate their OGI program compliance. Following something that's not traditional LDAR.
And Terrence, do you have any
for sure. Yeah, I agree with Deaver. I mean, that with the alternative work practice, adding in that once annual Method 21 on all components was about half the cost of a program, right? So it did make it, difficult, to stay competitive with normal Method 21 programs. But we've been able to show that we can do it in less cost, but it's still, I think, a big barrier to a lot of industry. And I think just in terms of why the slow uptake, I think, a lot of regulations, state regulations in specific, don't specifically allow, the OGI use, or in terms of alternative work practice, they allow it, but they have specific requirements you have to follow. So I think it's just been a bit of a slow uptake. But now with, the new regulations in Canada, the new proposed regulations to the EPA that we'll talk about are all based heavily on optic gas imaging. So I think it's now, finally coming to fruition where the new regulations are including or even focusing on OGI.
Yeah. Plus, certainly don't rule out fear of change.
Absolutely. So,
I guess go ahead.
No, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, I was just going to weigh in. I mean, I guess sitting in Colorado and formerly working in Wyoming, my experience is not that it's been slow to be adopted in regulations. So, but I'm not speaking for other states for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Colorado has definitely been ahead of the game. So to that point, because you guys have been using that technology for quite some time, and Terrence, you yourself has started out with a company using OGI as its main source of business. How is the industry complying with regulations using OGI? I think that's part of a lot of people's fear of change, is that they don't understand how using OGI, if it can't, see the small leaks, what's the benefit of using OGI from that big picture perspective, and how are people complying using it? Christy, maybe you want to go first.
Sure. I think that, it is a lot of data, and it's a lot of manpower intensive work. A lot of the conversations we have around what is the right frequency to be able to capture leaks and get the most economically efficient use of that technology. Particularly if you look at the Piceance Basin, which is more remote, you've got rough terrain, you're spending a lot of time driving around to find tiny leaks when you've got pumpers on site every day doing AVO. And so what is the right frequency? I also think that varies between dry gas plays and oil plays, depending on the type of fluids you're moving through your systems in terms of what's an appropriate frequency. And then again, I think the data systems used to capture this information to show compliance are really time intensive, cost intensive, and require just a lot of data gathering. And it can create a lot of compliance issues. I also think there's lots of moving targets in the rules themselves. In Colorado, we have federal land. We also have local government regulations, state regulations, and it's difficult to determine which intensity you're applying for what and how you're to what. And so that overlay also creates a lot of complexity in how this data is gathered and measured and compliance with rules.
And so as these new regulations that came out just yesterday, are allowing for OGI, and we'll get into more of the details of that later, but I think a lot can be learned from your state in general on the language that was used, and particularly of, the pitfalls perhaps of where industry feels like the language was written, we thought it was right at the time, and now it's not, right? And maybe allowing for more flexibility or being very specific. I know that, Method 21's been the same language for pretty much 30 years, and there's a lot of things that people would like to change in that regulation, or in that method rather. So Terrence, do you have some comments on how industry is complying with regulations using OGI?
Well, yeah, I think in general, depending on the regulation, whether it's state or federal, you have different requirements you have to follow when using the OGI. But also we've seen industry, especially more recently, use OGI, as more voluntary. So even in addition to the regulations, they might use OGI on areas that it would normally be regulated. But yeah, definitely the benefit of OGI, which I think the EPA has realized, is the speed in which you can detect emissions. So it's so much more efficient than Method 21, that you can find leaks so much faster, and that's, creates massive emission reduction. And I think a lot of the regulators are adopting that, not only for OGI, but for other alternative technologies, even beyond OGI, to keep finding finding the big leakers faster is what makes up for, 90% plus of your emission profile.
Right, and we always use that analogy of, would you rather turn off a fire hydrant or turn off the leaky faucet first, right? Which one's really creating more emissions? So great point. To Terrence and Christy again, so one of the issues that, to Deaver's point that he brought up, is that, people understand how to prove compliance with Method 21 now. There's been, audits and consent decrees, and people really understand, all the pitfalls. So one of the questions we get commonly is, when asked to prove that you were at a component on a particular day, how would you do that with OGI? How do you prove compliance?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways this might depending on the regulations. For example, if you're doing alternative work practice, you're required to record the entire survey. So you'd have video proof of each component being surveyed. Now, for example, for Quad OA regulation as it exists today, you don't need to record the survey. So you rely on a monitoring plan and a monitoring route in that facility. So you have to follow a certain route that you follow. And really it comes down to also to training. So, making sure that the technicians are properly trained and know what they're looking at, and ensuring that they're doing a thorough survey. We also have things like GPS tracking tools that we use to track where that technician is and where do they stop and how long were they there. So all that together can be used to prove compliance. But yeah, it is. Even with Method 21, how do you prove that Method 21 technician was at the component with their wand, right? It's not easy to prove without that video proof.
Yeah, I would second that. I mean, I think the GPS, time date stamps, saved recordings are critical. We often now have tablet systems that a camera inspector can enter real time the component that leaked, get the repair crew out. I would just add one other piece to that, and that's that, we're focused a lot now on alternative technologies outside of the traditional OGI cameras and looking at continuous real-time data collection for speciated VOCs, potentially HAPs. The state has vehicles as well. There's research crews out with vehicles. And so we're having to really show almost in real time through a host of big data what happened at a specific site. Not only that, but down to the component that leaked. And so there's lots of work going on here in that space. And I won't get into the details of it today, but there's lots and lots of new technology out there that's really making that very specific.
And that's a good spin for our next question, because it's not just about the regulations being right to support the technologies, but are companies in general more accepting of climate change initiatives? And I know, Scott, you and I had talked about this recently because you had been recently out to some conferences and you just were starting to see a shift. What does that look like for you?
No, absolutely, Tanya, you're right. I think industry recognizes that we all have to work together to solve these problems for the common good. When you look at the ESG reporting, it really creates a fascinating new paradigm that it allows companies to use data, accurate data, but it's beyond compliance. And what do I mean by that? I would think about emission factors. Our emission factors for a flare, for instance, truly 95%. That's one of the items that's in the Quad OB rule and Quad OC rule. So how are we validating these numbers? So how do we validate good numbers beyond just compliance? And that's where we need to embrace technology. So if you really want to know what the numbers are that you're reporting to the investment community, that you may be required to report on your 10K, that you're reporting to your CFO and your C-suite, how do we validate that number? We use technology, we use science. We want to make sure that we're using the right technology, that we're using capable, qualified people. And once you have that technology, I alluded to a little bit earlier, now data is power, and that power is to optimize. And the companies that use that data to optimize are going to have a significant advantage in the marketplace. And if you don't get ahead of this, EPA already said their top priorities are climate and enforcement. Doesn't mean you have to be the best. It's like, you don't have to be the fastest guy, you just need to be faster than the slowest guy when the bear comes after you. So you want to be able to use the data to optimize. In order to do that, you have to look at technology and not just do it the same way you've always done it. I love the band Rush, but they don't record any more music. We have to move on with life and look towards the future.
Great analogies. Thanks, Scott. All right, so there has been some amazing regulatory releases yesterday. And so Terrence, maybe you can give us a high-level overview about what came out yesterday. Initially, we thought it was going to be called Quad OB, but what is actually coming out is a series of regulations. So we have Quad OA, which had a little bit of updates, Quad OB, which is new, and Quad OC, which is also being proposed. So maybe you can give us an update on what you saw in that regulation and what industries are going to be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us on this presenting panel and a lot of the people calling in or listening in are probably into this new proposed documentation or document, and what that all means. I focused a lot on the LDAR side of things so far, so I haven't gone through the entire document, which is like 500 pages, but I do have a summary of what I looked at so far. So yeah, Quad OB would be new requirements on new and modified facilities. So the same facilities that were covered under Quad OA would be covered under Quad OB. And then Quad OC incorporates existing facilities. So they've kind of split them up to designate the two different types of facilities, but really the requirements are kind of the same for both somewhat. So for LDAR, one of the big changes that we saw was for gas plants. So instead of having to follow the alternative work practice that we talked about, which is bi-monthly OGI and one annual method 21, they removed the method 21 requirement. So now it's just bi-monthly, not biannual, bi-monthly off-the-gas imaging, so every 2 months, which is massive. So that's, before we said alternative work practice was about cost neutral. Now using OGI would be probably about 40% reduction in cost with gas plants. For well sites and compressors, they have different frequencies based on the estimated emissions of those facilities. So for example, well sites, you have that's well sites with baseline emissions at less than 3 tons per year. You're doing 1 survey and then not a survey again after that. Well sites with greater than 3 tons per year methane perform quarterly OGI surveys. And then there's even co-proposals of saying if it's 3 to 8 tons per year, you perform semi-annual OGI, and if it's over 8 tons per year, there's quarterly OGI. So EPA is obviously looking for input on what looks like the right frequency for these different emission profiles. For compressor stations, it's quarterly surveys. But for both well sites and compressors, they added an advanced methane detection caveat. So basically, if you use some type of advanced technology, that could be fixed wing aerial, that could be drone, it could be satellite, could be installed sensors. They don't really specify what technology. They just said that a minimum detection limit of 10 kilograms per hour would be needed to grade those systems. Which is a pretty high limit for most sites, especially for well sites. And then if you do that alternative or advanced method every 2 months, then you can reduce your frequency to once annual OGI or method 21. And then they also, as I mentioned, they also included continuous monitoring as an option. So really, there wasn't a lot of detail on what would be included. So I think there's going to be obviously a big approval process for different technologies that we're excited about. I mean, we have started doing drone surveys. We started doing a lot of vehicle-based detection, and we're one of the leaders in fixed sensors matrix. So all these technologies we've been using for advanced, beyond compliance, now that there's a chance to use these for compliance, which is pretty exciting. In terms of other, there's a lot of other requirements, not just LDAR in the new proposal. It includes, mostly around venting. So it's recapturing venting, whether it's tank venting, compressor seal venting, whether it's wet and dry seals, or rod packing, pneumatic, for pneumatics, it's requiring zero emission pneumatics. For pneumatic pumps, depending on the industry segment, you could require zero emission pumps or having to route the emissions from those pumps to a recovery system. For liquids unloading, for well completions, and for oil wells with associated gas, all of these, and for flaring, all of these are really looking at massive recovery or reduction in emissions. So it's quite wide ranging, and there's going to be a lot to pull out of this. But I think this is the wording of this is proposal. It's not even actual regulated wording. It doesn't have the specific regulation. It's just saying this is what we're proposing and this is what we want comments back on. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity to comment back and really try and make this regulation work, for industry and regulators.
And as a follow-up question, what do you see as such an advantage of this regulation coming out? Like, how could this impact industry in a positive way?
Well, I think, with regulating, new facilities that have never been regulated for at least, you're going to see mass opportunities to reduce emissions. And the companies are, getting pressure with ESG to reduce emissions and to improve compliance. This is an opportunity for industry to really, take a jump and get active with their emission reduction. And not only just with, like I said, just with, the existing technologies, but new technologies, which is really exciting. And that's one, same with what I mentioned with Canada, they allow, new technologies, which will really spur industry to embrace these new technologies and kind of get that next step into the future of leak detection and emission reduction.
Great, thank you. One of our, along with this regulation that came out, they reference Appendix K. And so Devert, you had been doing some reviews on this. What can you tell us about Appendix K and what's proposed?
Right. So at long last, we've been waiting all year for it. Appendix K is finally out. It's Appendix K to Part 60 as proposed, and it's called Determination of Volatile Organic Compound and Greenhouse Gas Leaks Using Optical Gas Imaging. It's 33 pages long, so about 7.5 times as long as Method 21, and as soon as you open it up, you will recognize it because they patterned it after the structure that is in Method 21 as far as the format and layout. So this monitoring protocol covers surveys of process equipment using OGI cameras in the oil and gas industry, and it goes from upstream production to downstream refining to distribution. Now, it's not applicable. I know there's some chemical companies on the phone. It is not applicable in this proposed rule to chemical plants or facilities outside of the oil and gas industry, but I think chemical companies should still take a look at it to see what is coming in the future, and please chime in. So I'll try to summarize at a high level some of the key elements in it because it's quite extensive and has a lot of detail to it. So the first key element is I've clustered a few together. It's got requirements for camera design, camera functionality. Those are specifications and whatnot. The ability to obviously see an image for a hydrocarbon leak, and there's performance verification requirements that go along with that. The second element is the need to develop and establish an operating envelope, which is really a combination of the delta temperature, the distance, and the wind speed to be able to image a plume, and that has to be done up front one time for each camera configuration. And different camera configurations could be a tripod, could be a tablet or a flip out. You have to establish this wide operating envelope, and that takes a little bit of doing. There's actually a panel of 3 out of 4 folks have to agree about what is imaged, and then they're going to need to follow that going forward. The third element is that camera operator training and performance verification and audits by a senior operator are going to be required. And they've defined a senior operator in the rule as someone who's done 500 OGI surveys. So that person will be needing to perform quarterly verification audits, and basically you'll need to apprentice under that person in order to get enough experience to one day become a senior operator. Again, it's a proposed rule, so all this is sort of up for comment, of course. The last element is a monitoring plan. There are specifics in the rule, but it does not have an EPA approval element, so you don't have to submit it and expect approval. And it's got procedures in it that are for ensuring that surveys are conducted under field conditions that are within the operating envelope of the camera that I just talked about. They also need to avoid operator fatigue. They've got 5-minute breaks every 20 minutes, for example, that they talk about in the protocol. Also documenting the monitoring surveys. There's an observation time that they mention, and it is 5 seconds per component in the field of view at different viewing angles. So let me just repeat that for everybody. 5 seconds per component is what they have laid out in Appendix K. So I think that's going to be a really interesting value for people to chime in on and opine on. I'm sure it's going to get a lot of comments. And then finally, the plan has to talk about monitoring surveys and documenting them using either a route map, visual cues, and they do mention streamers, which I think would be interesting in an operating refinery or a plant, or GPS routes with timestamps. So they do mention 3 different options. for keeping track of where the operators are while they're using the camera. My last comment is that it's important to note that EPA is proposing Appendix K, with this oil and gas rulemaking package, mainly because it's written for oil and gas production, again, production, refining, distribution. But they're taking comments for the entire sector on the protocol at this time. So the hope and I think approach is to put this out with the oil and gas rules because it is pertinent to them. But I think everybody should chime in because this is what EPA is, after a lot of consideration, proposing for using OGI and sort of retiring Method 21.
Thank you, Deaver. It's interesting because OGI and alternative technologies are already used at a lot of upstream and midstream facilities across the United States and other countries as well. But the refinery sector and downstream, it's fairly new. And what would be some of the bigger hurdles implementing OGI or an alternative technology at a refinery that sets that just a little bit different?
I think installing streamers is going to be a major hurdle. No, actually, in seriousness, I think that the refinery configuration is much more complex than a well site or compressor station. Of course, even a gas processing plant. You have refineries are decades old. The oldest refinery in the country is slightly older than I am, and I'm older than I look. And so you're going to have equipment that's more densely packed, less open space. So a uniform monitoring path and multiple viewing angles can be tricky. You also might see more ghost leaks from steam throughout the refinery. And I guess another hurdle would be that since a lot of refineries don't include connectors in their LDAR program, the first few couple rounds of OGI are certainly going to increase the repair workload. I think Terrence mentioned that earlier for operations and maintenance personnel. So be kind to those folks and give them some heads up when you start to implement an alternative technology like this that's going to turn up leaks that otherwise weren't previously identified.
Great, thank you. And at a state, Deaver, to you, at a state or local level, are we seeing regulatory updates hit across different states as well now that EPA is updating theirs?
Well, ultimately, Quad OC, which we don't really have time, I think, to go into in detail, is going to require states to have an equivalent OGI program. So I think that's now the driver. Otherwise, when you don't have in the absence of a regulation, states really don't drive the process and won't until EPA does or until the regulated community proposes change. So, in Texas, there's a facility that got approval for using OGI to meet the state BACT LDAR requirements. They actually have a 3-second viewing time, which is interesting compared to the 5 seconds that was just proposed in yesterday's Appendix K. But in general, rulemaking takes time. It's difficult for states to anticipate the future of technology. They're staying as stringent or more so than EPA, and so they necessarily take more time. And when you look back at OGI and when it came out in December of 2000, the AWP that is, when it came out in December of 2008, it took Texas 18 months until June of 2010 to write that into their Chapter 115 non-attainment rules. So that but rulemaking does take time. But now that these rules are out, I think there'll be a lot more action from states because they've got until I think 2023 to get these incorporated, the Quad OC in its final form incorporated into their state rules.
Great. And now, since we've had this regulation come out, this last question, which I was going to pose to all of you on the panel, is kind of, I think it's kind of answered for us, but I'll still let you chime in, is can we expect to see more regulatory acceptance of new technologies? Industry right now has really been asking for new technologies that's more efficient, and the world has definitely been preparing and proposing, but regulations haven't really been able to support those new technologies. Now with the two proposed we have out right now, it seems that that's really supporting what industry needs to become more cost efficient and truly reduce their emissions. So I'll leave it open to any of you. Do you have comments on, these new technologies and the acceptance? Are we going to have another, all these technologies and then, like OGI, no one implements it for years?
I can go first, I think. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of trials of different technologies here in Colorado, and I think it's an uphill battle. I think the technology needs to advance still a little bit, not in all cases, but in some. And I think it's very difficult to prove the efficiency of that technology and compare that to OGI as an example, or to other technologies to see what would get you the same level of reductions. And I think that the regulators are going to have a difficult time accepting newer technologies over the use of OGI. However, there are things that we don't talk well, say automation, that are kind of given real-time pressure reducers and things like that tell you when you have a leak. But I think it's going to take some time for us to prove those technologies are as efficient as OGI. And I shouldn't say efficient, effective.
Christy, I think you're 100% right. What we're seeing in different spaces is, look, this is an epic change in the environmental regulations and how we do business. There's going to be a lot of people coming into this market who make promises that they probably can't keep. As a receiver of these services, you have to do your due diligence and not fall for slick marketing campaigns. It may not be cool, but sometimes, the old-fashioned way is a better way or an accepted way. So you have to really be on the lookout for flashy technology that doesn't really perform.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that I think it's also important to look at these different technologies, not just as, well, I'm going to use a drone and that's going to solve my problems, or we're going to do satellite scanning and that's going to solve everything. You have to look at your type of facility and where your facilities are and what your requirements are, and come up with, usually a combination of technologies that'll work the best, right? Like, for example, we do facilities, we've been doing programs where we're using, vehicle-based monitoring or drone monitoring to identify facilities that would then trigger an OGI inspection. So it's using them in combination, right? We can't fly a drone into a compressor building and go and find leaks. We still need, that micro detection of optical gas imaging with a macro system that can help you to guide the monitoring frequencies. So I think the answer, in the long term with these new regulations is going to be, combining effective technologies to really just, get to those again, big leaks as fast as you can, and really create, significant emission reductions.
Right. And this is Beaver. I would also just add that there are, for new technologies, you've certainly got alternative means of emissions limitations out there, or emissions limitation. The AMLs, right? I think Molex is on the line, and they've certainly got a system that they've gotten approved, or at least out there for comment, and that's a different alternative technology that wasn't talked about until 2 or 3 years ago. So there is a means in the regulation, for acceptance of those new technologies. But I think Christy makes a very everybody actually made really strong points about combinations. As Terrence was saying, and also Christy's point about the going a little bit beyond OGI. It's hard for regulators to do that, and they probably won't do it as much. But if you've got something new, using AML, that's definitely an option.
Great, thank you everyone from our panelists. We're going to start taking some questions from the audience. We still have 5 minutes left for some questions. So let's see here. Given the scale, and this is probably best for Terrence, but feel free to chime in. Given scale of implementation, are you seeing cost savings as a result, both in terms of reduction in service costs and efficiency in deployment?
Yeah, so definitely, you know, if you have multiple clients in one area, and usually you do, you know, especially oil and gas, you have, you know, condensed areas where you have a lot of activity, a lot of facilities. So when you know, instead of going out to do, you know, company A's facilities and coming back and going to do company B facilities, you can combine those. So reduce the travel costs, which can be significant, especially for remote locations. You know, sometimes travel costs can be, you know, significantly more than the monitoring, you know, on-site monitoring costs. So there's efficiencies that can be done through scheduling. And then just, you know, efficiencies in you know, the process of doing OGI, for example, like, you know, having, you know, proper training programs, your technicians are following the proper procedures and speed of survey, but also for data management. It's probably one of the most highest impact on efficiencies is, you know, how are the technicians collecting data? How is that data stored? Is it checked for quality? You know, all that has to be built into a system that you know, creates efficiency.
Including the QA/QC of that data, right? So it's not only just about the process, but it's also about how can you efficiently verify the data of what occurred.
Yeah, and the other part too, which is
go ahead.
Sorry, which is significant. I'm just getting an echo from you there, Tanya. The other part significant is also on the repair side. So usually that, you know, repairs are done by our clients, maintenance personnel, or they may have contract personnel. So, you know, getting an effective system to get the leak data to the right individuals in that facility so that they can start implementing repairs and then tracking those repairs and collecting all that data is really important. And it's, you know, one area that can, you know, if it's not efficient and effective, it can increase cost of repair significantly. So having an effective communication system that works properly. For example, one thing we've done is link our data management system directly to work order systems of our clients. So when we find a leak and it gets synced to our system, it automatically sends a work order to that operator that he needs to repair that leak. He repairs it through his normal maintenance procedures, and then the data gets kicked back to us. That type of thing reduces costs and increases efficiency significantly.
So we have time for one more question. Has OGI technology progressed to where it replaces on-the-ground inspections?
Well, OGI is on-the-ground inspection. Like OGI, you know, optic gas imaging would be a technician holding a camera, walking through a facility and doing the survey. So yeah, it's. I mean, that's, you know, again, with the new regulation, OGI is basically the, you know, the main service or main technology for this new reg, or changes in the new regs.
Great, and if anyone else has additional questions, please feel free to submit them and we'll follow up afterwards. Also, we'll be sending out resource links for topics that we discussed today so that you have more information that you can take back and review and spend some time on it. But I really appreciate everyone coming here today. So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with some parting advice regarding next steps. Consider it the final piece of the puzzle for your life hack that you'll help quickly go from shock and disorientation of your fear of change to acceptance and moving forward. The truth is that more regulatory updates are coming our way, and with the hope that you've gained a great deal of knowledge during this webinar around this particular update, knowledge is the only power if you put it to use. So you might feel more confident now in your ability to tackle these regulatory changes with a more proactive approach, and that's fantastic. But as you learn more and consider the elements of the other regulatory changes, that feeling of shock and disorientation will likely return. So we hope that we've given you more tools in your toolbox to address these changes. And instead of hiding from change, that you can face it head on and embrace it. So the more knowledge you seek, the greater clarity you will have, and the sooner you'll overcome your fear of change. and let's keep moving forward and embracing change. So I also want to redirect you to our Fear of Change series. If you missed any of our previous webinars, feel free to go on the Montrose website and you can see the link to any of those previous ones, as well as on the BIC link after this. And I'll turn it back over to BIC. Thank you, everyone, and our panelists for joining us today. And I hope it was an enjoyable experience and you have something to take away. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tanya. And thanks again to our sponsor, Montrose. Please visit them at montrose-env.com. On behalf of everyone at BIC Magazine, I'd like to thank you for attending. You can watch and share the recorded presentation in about 2 hours at bicwebinars.com or by using the same link you used today. By the way, BIC is hosting an industry roundtable titled Improving Process Safety with Technology, Training, and Transparency, scheduled for Wednesday, December 1st at 11 a.m. Central. You can find the link to register at bicwebinars.com. You'll want to be sure to sign up for this soon. Please bookmark bicmagazine.com for daily access to articles and videos on current news, trends, industry expansions, and technical knowledge you need to stay ahead in your business. Hey everyone, have a wonderful and safe day.